Dave Messenger's going to be down around 11:30 or so, talk about projects, and that whatever slides he brings in, I'll post those out on the site so you can look at those after the fact and make some decisions. All right, so I know I said today I wanted to go over band selection, or optimal band selection, but then I realized that I still need to go over principal components with you guys and make sure that we're clear on that. So we'll probably push that topic off until Tuesday, and we'll finish up with that one. I do have the test made up for next week. I'd like to just, give you an indication of, the kind of stuff that's going to be on there. Turns out there's going to be 4 questions like it was the last couple times here. And 2 of them are going to be computational sorts of questions, where I'll give you a problem, kind of plug through the numbers, and 2 of them are going to be very conceptual. So I want you to really understand something. And think about what we've done since the last test. We've talked about classification, we've talked about multispectral systems. We've talked about evaluating classifications, right? So things that are going to be fair game on this one, or anything having to do with minimum distance to the mean, Gaussian maximum likelihood classifiers, spectral angle mapper, those sorts of things. Contingency tables, confusion matrices, the stuff we went over last time. That's really, that's something that's going to be unique to this class. You're not going to see that again somewhere else most likely, so that's a really important topic. Make sure you completely understand what's going on there. And I did take one of the questions. I know I said this wasn't going to be a final, but one of the questions is going to begin off, with the statement, taking everything that you've learned this quarter. I'm going to ask you to come up with sort of a methodology to do something. I'm not going to tell you what that something is, but what I want you to keep in mind is, we went through a lot of stuff this quarter. We looked at how you can look at imagery in the cues, right? We started off doing image interpretation. We talked about things like, shape and tone and texture and all those kind of things, and how they help you as an observer see what's going on in the scene. We did a lot of understanding what goes on in the big equation. We talked about calibration, right? Being able to take data that reaches a sensor and invert that back down to temperature or to reflectance on the ground. Those sorts of things are what make you guys different than most people who go through remote sensing programs, in the sense that you understand all the I'll say the techie aspects of remote sensing, right? How do you take a digital count, which is where most people stop. Most people take a digital count and they do something with that digital count. I really want you guys to understand that that's only the beginning, right? That digital count came from something. It came from energy that left the ground because of some physical process that occurred. Right? And that's I think really important, a really important distinction between the kind of stuff we do in this class and the kind of stuff that you would see at most other universities, I think. So there'll be one question that kind of has you try to pull everything together, answering that methodology. All right, now logistically, I'll be here on Tuesday for class. I got to take off for playing in the afternoon, so I'll probably be leaving campus right after class on Tuesday. I'll be gone Wednesday. I should be back Thursday for the test. I have a 2-hour end between an end of a meeting and a flight, and the airport's an hour and 20 minutes away from where I have to leave. So if I miss my plane, which is a very high probability, I'll have Monica come in and give the test again. Right, hopefully I'll be back though, because I know it's the last flight out of Aiken, South Carolina. There's not a lot of flights out of there every day. But if everything goes well, I'll be back for that. So that being said, if you have any questions that you come up with over the weekend, and take part of Monday's class and review any stuff that you want to from the entire quarter. So make sure you have those ready, because like I said, I'll probably be out of hand Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday.
Since I have the confusion matrices that we had, you say covariance?
Contingency tables. The same name, right? Confusion matrix or contingency table is the same thing. Depends if you're a statistician or a remote sensor, I guess. Statisticians call them contingency tables.
Can we get a sheet to write down the equations for like standard deviation, that kind of stuff?
standard deviation.
I know, and the calcium maximum likelihood and all that.
Oh, okay, all right, all right. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah, so if you want to page your notes for this one, I was just trying to go through everything real quick. That would be fine. All right. So any questions right now? Is the lab going okay? No problems? Nothing broke this time? Everything's working?
I haven't broken it yet.
All right, well, that's good. Okay. All right, so what I want to do today is take a closer look. We talked real briefly when we started talking about multivariate data sources, about principal components and eigenvectors. I want to go over that stuff a little bit again, and then take a look at how we actually use that to help us with classification. And I want to take a look at a variant on principal components, which is called minimum noise fraction, which is a technique that's come up, and it actually came up back in the late 1980s, but it's implemented more recently in some of the commercially available data analysis packages, and it really does offer some real nice benefits over traditional PCA analysis, so I want to go through that. All right, again, these are notes. There's the notes that are in the remote sensing class online are good. The chapter 9 ones, the last half of that section is on principal components. They're good. These notes are like I said previously, these are from the image processing class, so you can download those also. This is session 14 that goes through that. These will be labeled spectral data compression because that's what we will use it for in image processing, is as a compression technique. But the mathematics behind everything is the same. So I'm just going to go through these particular slides as opposed to the other ones, but a lot of the same material is there. All right. So correlation, right, is the biggest factor in multivariate data sets that leads to redundancy in data. So when you're talking about compression, when you have too much data to represent information, reducing redundancy is very important, just to make your data sizes smaller. Right? But that's an image processing sort of point of view. From a remote sensing point of view, correlation between data sometimes will cause the process that you're trying to do, something like the Gaussian maximum likelihood classification, for instance, it'll cause it to perform worse than it might. All right, it could degrade the performance of it in some ways because we do things, you know, like take the inverses of very large matrices, right? If you look at the Mahalanobis distance, the covariance matrix in there, remember, its dimension depends on the number of bands in your data set. So if you have a 200 band data set, that matrix is 200 by 200 in size. Right? And then you're trying to invert that sort of a matrix. All right, so now where does the problem come into play there? Well, it's great if you have enough data to really get a good statistical sampling of your population to define that matrix very well. Right? You're talking about, what, 40,000 covariance values in that matrix. I mean, how many points do you need to make sure you get a very good estimate of that covariance matrix? Well, again, you know, as in most statistical things, there's no, you know, rule of thumb. There's a certain minimum number you need to get there. But in order for that matrix to become well behaved, in other words, to not have singularities in it, you need to have lots of data, right, to represent that. And a lot of times, when you go off and you pick regions of interest, I don't know if you started that portion of the laboratory, how big are your ROIs? I mean, do you have any ideas? I mean, they're probably pretty small compared to the total image size, for sure. And you know, the points are probably in the hundreds, right? So let's say you picked 400 points to represent a particular sample, and then you try to form a 200 by 200 covariance matrix. Deep down inside, even if you're not a professional statistician, you probably have a feeling that that's not going to give you the best estimate, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's always that rule of thumb that you should have, you know, for a student t-test, if you're comparing two means, you should have 30 samples, right? That number always came up in stats. As a good rule of thumb, you should probably have about 30 times the number of bands that you have as far as data points. So if you have a 200 band system, you might want to go off and get 6,000 points to represent a covariance matrix. There's a lot of times you're not going to be able to find 6,000 points because there won't be that many pixels in the scene. But those are the sorts of numbers you want to get into. All right, now if you don't get there, that's fine. I mean, you only have as much data as you have. But if you don't get there, you might start to see some mathematical instabilities in things like inverses from interest. All right, one of the things we can do though is how about we take a look at the data itself. And the data itself is non-unique, it's redundant, right? So if we look at spectral signatures, if we look at in this, let's say the data we have at this point is spectral in nature, if we look at those spectral curves, they have a very smooth shape to them. You could predict the reflectance at one wavelength if you know the reflectance at the immediately adjacent wavelength. You could probably do it pretty well, okay? And because you could do that, that means that there is, in that data set, a lot of built-in redundancy that we can get rid of. Okay? So that's what we're going to do with the principal components, is reduce that redundancy. Now, if we could do that very successfully, we might take 200 bands and represent 98% of the information in the entire data set in 6 bands. Right? We might be able to come up with a transformation where we can come up with 6 new bands that could represent 98% of that info. Right? If we could do that, now we don't need nearly the number of points to do the training that we did when we had 200 bands, and we can get a much more well-behaved statistic, particularly the covariance matrix in this case. Does that make sense? All right.
You're going to use the same number of samples that you had in order to get like the 200 by 200 to get the 6 by 6?
You wouldn't need it.
I'm saying that you have a number of points, right? That's what you have. You don't have any more.
Right. Let's say we have 400 points.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's either that you're going to use these 400 points in order to come up with the 200 by 200, or to come up with the 6 by 6 after that you did the PCA.
Yes. Yes. And in that case, if we had 6,
is when the 400 points are, it's not the data that I'm using that is redundant.
Each of those 400 points, is made up of 200 data elements. Let's say we have a 200 band system, right? In the 200 data element direction, that's where the redundancy comes into play. So it's the individual variables that you're looking at. And obviously there's other things that come out of that. If you only have 6 bands, you can compute the inverse of a 6 by 6 matrix a lot faster than you can on 200 by 200. And so these kind of things come into play also, but they shouldn't be the most important driving factor. All right, so we talked at the, maybe a couple classes ago about this concept of coming up with a linear transformation, right? That would take an observation, a multivariate observation x, so that's a vector x, some transformation matrix that we could come up with a new representation of x called y. So if you write anything in this form, this is just a, if this is an n by 1 column vector x, this would be an n by n transformation matrix G, which would give it an n by 1 column vector y. So you're taking x, and for each element of y, you're doing some sort of linear combination of the members of x to come up with a single member of y. And then you'll do n of those linear transformations to come up with each element of y. So, for instance, if we have y sub 1, the first element of this column vector y sub 1 is going to be a linear combination of x sub 1 through x sub n. And it'll have a particular set of coefficients that does that linear combination with. Y sub 2 is going to be another linear combination of x sub 1 through x sub n, just with a different set of coefficients. All right. Now, what we're going to try to do here is come up with this transformation G so that we reduce the redundancy in the data set and trying to achieve our goal of reducing the number of bands that are actually meaningful. Okay, so in Y space, all right, this is after our transformation G is applied, we can look at the covariance of that new data set. All right, so we have a new data set Y. So if we had 400 points representing 400 different X observations, right, each of which had 200 elements in it, we would now have 400 new points, which form this data space Y. Each of those would still have 200 data elements in them. Okay? So just as we can compute a covariance matrix in the X domain, in our original digital count domain, or radiance domain, if we converted it back to radiance, we could do the same thing in the transform data space Y. Right? And we'd write that, simply as in a multivariate case, the expected value of Y minus the mean vector squared. Right? Or in matrix format, Y minus the mean vector times Y minus the mean vector transpose. Okay. So that's the expected value of the covariance matrix in this case. All right. Now, the mean in Y is just the expected value of all the Y's, right? That vector. So that's just a straight definition. So let's just go through a little derivation here to see how we can get use of Y, our new mean, from our old use of X. Right? Well, what is Y? Well, Y was G times X, that linear transformation. So I have the expected value of G times X. If I had K components inside of X, I can go through and I can do that matrix multiplication. And the expected value would be the mean of that. So I would go through and I would divide by the total number of bands that I had in my system. Now, the G is constant, it's just a transformation matrix, so I can pull that outside of the summation. And what do I wind up with here? Well, if I look at just this portion right there, I have the sum of all the values in my, or for all my values for all my observations of X, and the sum. So I have an n-element vector, an n-column vector. Each of the elements now is just a summation of all the values for all the observations that I've made. If I divide that by K, I wind up with my mean vector. And so this is just equivalent to taking, if I had 400 points that I had in my training sample, and I added those 400 points together, that's all I'm doing right here, from 1 to K, divide by 400, I wind up with my mean vector.
How's that a vector? Isn't that just a number?
Well, X in this case is a vector, right? X was an observation. It's a pixel. It has 200 digital counts associated with it. So this is a vector sum, right? So we're still, if it's not obvious there, it's still bold-faced, right? So this is still a vector in this case. And so the summation here is a vector over all the observations that we made, over all the pixels. But this sum is a sum of 400, let's say, 200 element vectors. So 400, 200 band vectors.
And Y would be only like 6, 1 by 6.
No, Y is going to be 200 elements at this point. Because remember, in order for this let's go back one slide here. In order for this transformation to work, if X is 200 by 1, this has to be 200 by 1. This is a square transformation matrix. I'm not saying everything in this new vector is going to be meaningful, right? And we'll get to that in a second. All right, so if I take this, if I take this 1 over K times the summation of these X vectors, these column vectors, that's just the expected value of X, right? Or the mean, right? So I think it's probably pretty obvious that the mean of Y is going to be G times the mean of X. But just want to show you how you can get there if you want to.
So it's the mean in every single band.
It is a mean vector, so it represents each element is the mean of the individual band.
And we would do
X.
this for each ROI for the whole band?
Well, I mean, if you're doing classification and you need a mean vector, you would do this for each land cover type. right? You could have multiple ROIs representing a land cover type, so I don't want to say it's just for an ROI, but it's for representative samples for a land cover type. All right, now the covariance matrix, what is that? Well, that's the expected value of the transformed x values times the transform, or minus the transform mean. Okay, so this is just y minus mu sub y. I've just written it this way. You'll see why in a second. So that's y. That's mu sub y. And the covariance matrix is going to be the expected value of that difference squared, or in matrix format, that difference times its transpose. Okay. Now, why did I write it this way? Well, I wrote it this way because I want to get to a closed form solution for the covariance matrix for y in terms of the covariance matrix of x. Right? So if I want to go in and separate things here, well, this g is a constant again. It's just a matrix of coefficients. We can factor that outside, pre and post, for the non-transposed and transposed term. And what am I left with in the middle here? Well, since g and g transpose are constants, I can bring those outside, and I'm left with the expected value of x minus mu sub x. What is that? I'm sorry, squared. That's the covariance matrix for x. All right, so I can rewrite this all as g times the covariance matrix of x times g transpose. Right? And if you look back in your matrix algebra, your linear algebra in the past, that form right here is the form for a process that we call the diagonalization of a matrix. Okay? So the covariance of y is the diagonalization of the covariance of x. Okay? Now, this covariance matrix in x space is related to this matrix in y space. Right? They have to represent something very similar to one another. These covariance matrices represent variance within the data set. Right? If I transform a data set, if I do a linear transformation, y equals g times x, have I gotten rid of any variation in the data set? Or is it just in a new form? Yeah, it should just be in a new form, right? So if I looked at if I had this magic number, which was the total variation in the data set y, and this magic number, which is the total variation in the data set x, those have to be the same. Okay? So that turns out to be the case when you diagonalize a matrix. When you diagonalize a matrix, what happens? All the off-diagonal terms become 0. You have terms along the major diagonal. If I choose to perform this transformation in a very particular way, and the way we chose was the way we talked about the other day, was to have this matrix of transformation coefficients be the eigenvectors of the original covariance matrix. If I do that, then this diagonalization of sigma sub x, the major diagonal terms turn out to be the eigenvalues. Right? And the eigenvalues for a data set represent the spread, the variance of that data set. Right? So essentially these are sigma squared terms for a single band of our new data set. Right? So this is the covariance of y, lambda sub 1, which is the first eigenvalue, is the variance of, I'll put band in quotes, right? But band 1 of the transformed data set. Right? I put band in quotes because it's not a sensor band anymore. It's a transformation that's a linear combination of the original sensor bands. Right? But we'll still refer to them typically as eigenvector bands or principal component bands. And lambda sub 2 subsequently is the variance of the transformed band 2, and so on. Now, if I look at the variance in each of the individual bands here in the transformed data space, and I add all those up, that represents the total amount of variation or variance in the new data system in Y. Okay. Well, it'll turn out that if I look at the major diagonal of the covariance matrix of X, and I look at those terms, they represent the variance in the original sensor bands. Right? If I add up that trace and I add up this trace, they have to be identical because they need to represent the same amount of data, right? But the distribution of that variance might be very, very different. And we'll take a look at how that changes in a second.
Yep. Question. So you say that each eigenvalue is the variance at each band,
Of the new transformed data set.
but is the variance or it's a representation of the variance of the data? I mean, is that the actual?
No, I know what you're saying. I want to make sure that's very clear. All right, so let's just look at the first transformed band, right? So we have y equals g times x. The first element of y1, is that linear combination of all the bands in x. Okay, so y1 equals some coefficient times x1 plus some coefficient times x2, dot, 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 plus some coefficient times x in there, where it's the number of bands. So now, what lambda 1 is, that first eigenvalue, is the variance of all the y1 data points in my new data set. So if I had 400 data points that I selected, each had 200 observations, so 200 bands associated with it. That was my original data x. So pixels out of a hyperspectral image. Chose 400 of them, each one of them had 200 bands. Y1 is a combination of those 200 bands, right, for each of the 400 data points that I selected. So I'd have 400 Y1s. Lambda 1, that eigenvalue, is the variance of Y1.
Okay.
The upper left-hand element of the covariance of x was the variance of the physical band one from the original data. Those two have nothing to do with one another anymore, right? Because the y's are linear combinations of all the x's.
Right.
But this is
it's just
truly the variance of that new transformed
Of the
data.
transform data. Okay.
Okay, so if I go ahead and I look at, I took a covariance matrix for that Landsat image that we've been using as an example here in class. And there was 6 bands total, so I get a 6 by 6 matrix. Take that covariance matrix, compute its eigenvectors and its eigenvalues. I use the eigenvectors to transform the original data set. So my original points, I transfer them using the eigenvectors as the coefficients. Is that clear? That's what I'm going to do here. So my G matrix okay, so these are all vectors, right? And my G matrix here is it's going to have elements that look like this. Let me put 2 rows in here. Okay, now what are these? Right, each row of this matrix G, this is going to be the first eigenvector. This is the, let's say eigenvector 1. This is going to be eigenvector 2. And so on, down to eigenvector n. So if I take any particular observation x, x1, x2, 3, and so on down to xn. That's a pixel, right? And that's its n bands. If I multiply these two matrices together, I'll multiply this row times this column, and I'll get a scalar, which would be y1. Right? So the eigenvector formed the coefficients for that transformation for each element of the new space I'm going to, the y space. Now, this eigenvector, the first eigenvector, corresponds to the first eigenvalue. The second eigenvector corresponds to the second eigenvalue, and so on. Right? That's just an important notation. It's not involved in this transformation. But the eigenvectors, the order they appear, the rows they appear in this matrix should appear in the same order as the eigenvalues. And most of the routines that you would use to compute these will put them in the same order for you. All right, now, if I, let me see, somewhere in the previous slide, we had a covariance matrix for this data set. Okay, I don't remember which one. This was the covariance matrix for the urban. This is the covariance matrix for the big water. I don't remember which this was offhand, but that's okay. So if I go ahead and I transform my data, y equals g times x, and I compute the covariance matrix of my new data y, just like the theory said here, the diagonalization should give me a diagonal matrix. In reality, it's exactly what I get. Okay. Now look at this covariance matrix for a second. Okay, this is the covariance matrix y, and obviously all the off-diagonal terms are 0, which means there's what's missing from the data set. What concept's missing from this data set? There's no correlation, right? So these bands are totally uncorrelated with one another. So there's no redundancy anymore in this data. All right, and these individual elements, lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda n, those represented the variance in the new bands. So check out what the variances look like. Right, the variance in band 1 of the transformed data set, principal component data set, variance in band 2, band 3, and so on. They're very large up in the upper left-hand corner, and they get very small down in the lower right-hand corner. All right, if these represent the total variance in the data system, right, in the whole data set, if the variance in that data set is represented by these numbers, well, this one represents 56.5% of all the variance. Right? If I add all these numbers up, and so I can take the trace of this matrix and take each of these elements and divide by the trace of the matrix, I'll get the percentage of the variance that's explained by each one of them. So this one explains 28%. This one explains 12%. This one's 1.5%, 8/10 and 2/10 of a percent as I go down that diagonal. So here's the values, this percentage of the variance that's explained by each of the individual elements. Now, if you look at those values and you were to plot them, right, as a function of band number, I'll clarify that here. It's the principal component band number, and this is the variance. And so I'll label this two ways. I'll label it as sigma squared, and I'll also label it as lambda, right? The eigenvalue. And so if you plot the eigenvalues or the variances as a function of band number, what do we have? 999, 506, 202. So 999, about half of that, 506, a fifth of that, 202, and then 27, 14, and 3. 20, 27, 14, and 3. Right? If you make this plot, you get a curve that looks like this. This particular type of a plot, where you plot eigenvalue or variance as a function of the band number, is called a scree plot. Right? And you will typically see, if your original data set had a lot of redundancy in it, you'll typically see a very steep decline at the beginning and then it'll level off. Right? So the question becomes, at some point, if I look at this cumulative variance explained by the bands as we increase, and that's what I have here in the last column, the cumulative variance explained by the bands up to that point, what does it say? Well, with the first band I explained 56.5% of the variance. With the first two, 85%. With the first three, 97.5%. With the first four, 99%. Now, if you can make a decision and say, you know what, if I only care about having 99% of the information, or 99% of the variance in the data, or the entropy, you can use all these different terms to represent the information content in your data set. But if you're happy enough to say, hey, 99% of it's explained by the first four bands, maybe I throw these last two transformation bands away. Right, just get rid of them. Now I can reduce the size of my covariance matrix down to 4 by 4, reduce my data set down to 4 bands rather than 6 bands, and still represent 99% of all the information in my data set. Now for Landsat data, I don't know if you're comfortable saying 4 bands, and maybe you'd be very comfortable saying 5 bands, but you know, if you had 5 bands, what the heck, put the 6th of them. It doesn't really make a difference, right? But if you had 200 bands, what you'd see on some of those data sets is that, you know, if I took an avarice image, for instance, and I looked at the 224 bands that are in an avarice image, and I do a principal component transform in a covariance matrix for a particular band, it is not surprising to see the 99% of that variance being explained in the first 10 principal component bands. So now you're reducing 224 down to 10. That's significant. And we'll look at a visualization of that in a second. All right, so for a simple 2-band sort of system, you know, here I have each of my x elements is a 2 by 1 matrix, right? So this is indicative of a 2-band imaging system. Right, and here's 6 observations, or 6 points. Right, so 2, 2, that's band 1 and band 2 for observation number 1. 2, 3 is band 1 and band 2 for observation number 2, and so on. I can go ahead and I can compute these principal components, right? And how do I do that? Well, I know I need to come up with the expected value of x minus mu, right? And square that. That's going to be my covariance matrix. So what I've done here is just in a tabular form, kind of did that. This is x minus mu, right? Mu in this case is 3.5, 3.5 for these 6 data points. If I subtract 3.5 from each of these, I get x minus mu. And then if I multiply that by the transpose of this column vector, I get this 2 by 2 for each of the observation points. And then if I take the average of those, I get my covariance matrix. Right, so just simple computation to go to covariance matrix. Now remember, to find the eigenvalues of a system, we solve what's called the characteristic equation, which says that, you know, there was a matrix out there that if I multiplied it by sigma sub x, I would get the same thing as multiplying by a scalar lambda, right? That was what we talked about a couple days back, and that was the condition we wanted to satisfy. Well, if that was the case, well, here's my covariance matrix, and I could subtract from that lambda times an identity matrix, just to put lambda in matrix form, that's scalar. And I'd want that to equal 0. The determinant of that to equal 0 in this case. All right, so if I go ahead and I take that covariance matrix, and I form an identity matrix the same size, so 2 by 2, I can rewrite that equation in this form. I could multiply everything out and subtract the 2 matrices that I have, and I'm left with a determinant of, you know, 1.9 minus lambda, and then my off-diagonal terms are the same because the covariance will be the same. It's a symmetric matrix, and then the variance down here, or the representative of that, is 1.1 minus lambda again. All right, I can compute the determinant of that. Right, just take the the major diagonal product minus the off-diagonal product, or the minor diagonal product, and subtract those two. It should equal 0. I could expand all that out and combine terms, and I wind up with a nice little quadratic equation. And dig deep into your past, so you remember how to solve a quadratic equation, right? So you plug that into your old equation, you find the two roots of this equation. And there's my two roots, 2.67 and 0.33. All right, now, those are my two eigenvalues. Those are my values for lambda. Okay, so that's eigenvalue 1 and eigenvalue 2. I could form my covariance matrix for Y, my transformed data set, just by placing those on a major diagonal, and there's my covariance matrix. All right, so here's the fun part, right? Remember we said that the variance in the two systems has to be the same. Well, let's check that that's true. 2.67 plus 0.33 is 3. 1.9 plus 1.1 is 3. So everything worked out. All right, we maintain our variance. We still have the same amount of variance explained, but we've removed the correlation from the data set. Okay, so once you have your eigenvalues, now you can go ahead and you can solve for those coefficients that you need, those eigenvectors.
Carl, what was the matrix underneath your,
The row.
yeah, the rows of that?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's just a correlation matrix. Remember, you can derive correlation from covariance by taking the covariance terms and dividing by the magnitudes of the individual variance terms. So it's a normalized version of the covariance matrix. Normalized version of the covariance matrix is the correlation matrix. So correlation in this case, remember, a variable correlated with itself is perfect, right? So you have ones on a major diagonal. You always have ones on a major diagonal correlation matrix. And then the off-diagonal terms represent the correlation between the variables. So the correlation between the x of 1s and the x of 2s for these 6 data points is 0.76.
So that is 1.1 divided by 1.9 times something or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Divided by sigma x multiplied by sigma 1.
Okay.
Or the standard.
The product of the standard deviations are the normalizing terms that you put in. All right, so now what we'd like to do is we'd like to solve for the eigenvector, right? So let's solve for the first eigenvector first. Right, so we're going to take that characteristic equation, we're going to multiply that by a vector g, and we hope to come out with 0. Right? So I have my covariance matrix of x, right here. I have my vector g, g11 and g21. That's the elements, the individual coefficients for my eigenvector. So I just brought the g inside. And then I took lambda 1, which was 2.67. That was my first eigenvalue. Multiply that by the identity matrix, and then multiply that by that vector g. So I just wrote that out. Go ahead and multiply everything out, combine terms, and what do you wind up with? Well, you wind up with 2 equations with 2 unknowns. So if I multiply everything out here, I wind up with these 2 equations, and what I want to solve for is the 2 unknowns, the 2 coefficients g. And so I can take either, any sort of approach I want to that. This is really easy because they're set equal to 0. So I can solve for g1 in terms of g11 in terms of g21, and I can come out with this equation right here. So any set of values, any scalars, g1 and g2 that would satisfy this equation can be the coefficients, right? So an eigenvector it's a vector, so it points in a particular direction. The magnitude of that vector doesn't matter; it still points in that same direction. But traditionally, you represent an eigenvector as a unit vector. So you come up with the unit vector coefficients to make that true. All right, so that's what I'm saying right here, is that we'd like to satisfy this condition also. All right, so how do we do that? Well, I had this equation. I can substitute in for G1 what I represented it as on the previous slide there, G of 1.43 times G21, and combine terms and solve it. So I get, what, 3.04 times G21 squared equals 1. Solve that, and I wind up with 0.57. Right? I can do the same thing for G11, and I come up with 0.82. So that says that my first eigenvector is represented right here. All right, now, I could do the same thing for G2, my second eigenvector, and I wind up with this right here. And if you look at those two vectors, what can you tell me about them? Just from looking at them. They're orthogonal to one another, right? Okay. All right, so now I have my vector G. Oh, I'm sorry, my matrix G, my transformation matrix, which is just the individual eigenvectors in the rows. And they're represented here as the transpose of that. So here they are in the rows. And I can transform my original data points. These are my 6 original data points right here. I can transform them by that matrix and wind up with my new data set Y. And if I go ahead and I plot that, these points right here are in the X1, X2 space. That's my original data space. And you can see that they're kind of in an oval here. Right? And if I plot my eigenvectors, that's this square right here and this square right here. And if I just drew vectors through them, you can see that I still have a new set of axes, essentially. They're orthogonal to one another. They form a 90-degree angle right here. But what do you notice about the data with respect to those new axes? So let's turn our heads a little bit, right?
There's a lot of variance on the first axis and much less on the second.
So a lot of variance on the first as opposed to the second. What were the eigenvalues? There were 2.67 and 0.33. 2.67 is the variance along Y1. 0.33 is the variance along Y2. And if you order your eigenvectors in decreasing order of eigenvalue, you'll always cause that to happen. That the first eigenvector transform, or the first principal component then, will have the greatest variance. And the variance will go down after that. Imagine that you do this in 200 space. The variance becomes very, very small on all of those coefficients on the higher order terms. Right? Where it becomes small depends on your data set. But like I said, for most remote sensing kinds of data, that might be after 10 or 20 bands, at most after a 200 band set. So if I rotated my data, or rotated my axes, and this is Y1 and Y2, so essentially I just redid this plot, you can see that data forms this sort of ellipsoid over here. And if you look at the axes, it turns out that everything works out to be the circle here is a ellipsoid from a 2-dimensional normal distribution with those standard deviations. And so, and it kind of fits the data just perfect. What else do you notice about this data now? We said this transformation removed correlation, right? Is this data any longer correlated? Right, correlation implies that you can predict Y from X, right? Or in this case, you can predict Y2 from Y1. Can you predict Y2 from Y1 anymore? And I can get the same Y2 value from at least, probably many values of Y1 anywhere in this data set.
But it's still it's not a random, right? They are concentrated in a certain area, right? They are.
But the correlation, if you went and computed that correlation is 0. So it's not random. There's structure to where I place these data points, but there's no predictive power any longer. I can't predict Y2 from Y1. If you did a linear regression between those two data points, your R squared would come out to be 0, right? Because R comes out to be 0. Correlation in this case is 0. Make sense? Right, so this is really the meat of it all, right? What does a principal component transform do? It rotates your axes, right? It rotates your axes so that the variance is maximized along the first principal component, then maximized along the second, then maximized along the third in decreasing order. Right? And the axes are rotated so that there is no correlation left in your data set. So that's the big takeaway from all this. All right, now let's take a look at what this does to the data set. So what I have here is I have a movie. All right, now what is this movie? This is a avarice image from Cuprate, Nevada. Right? It's a mountainous region out in Nevada, fairly clear ground, right? So there's not a lot of vegetation or anything on the ground here, and there's all kind of geological materials here. There's probably 20 or 30 different geological materials that are exposed and viewable. And what I put together here is a movie of the 224 bands that are derived from a principal component transformation. All right, so let me ask you what you expect to see here. All right, remember, principal component band 1 is a linear combination of all the original bands. Principal component band 2 is the linear combination of all the original bands, and so on. So every frame of this movie is a linear combination of all the bands in the original data set. Okay? The variance in each of these bands is the eigenvalue. And the eigenvalues will decrease very steeply in magnitude as we go through this movie. So if the variance decreases, what do you expect to see in the movie as the frames go on? Lose contrast. All right, so let's go ahead and play this. So there's 200 frames. All right, so I think I could. All right, so here's the early frame. The first principal component will always tend to be, when you do an eigenvector transformation, I mentioned this the other day, the coefficients in the first eigenvector are always going to be at the same sign. Okay, so they'll either all be negative or all be positive, depending on the implementation, the algorithm that somebody wrote to come up with this. They'll always be the same sign. So it's a direct linear combination with coefficients of all the same sign. So this frame right here is essentially some sort of weighted average. So it's an average brightness image, you might call it. Right? Now, after that, once you go to frame 2, I don't know what that is. All right, as far as physical, right? I can't put a physical meaning on what I'm seeing here. This one I can. It's an average of the brightnesses across all the bands. This one, the coefficients aren't necessarily of the same sign. So all bets are off of what this is physically. Same thing with the rest of them. And you can see, right, look at these as you go frame by frame. And you get dramatic changes in brightness at all these levels. Now that being said, as we go further and further, tell me what else you notice. Much noisier. Okay. And as I keep on going,
You lose any structure.
you lose the structure, right? The structure goes away. But every so often, something comes back.
Why?
Good question.
That's weird that I thought there was more information in the static ones.
What's that?
It's weird that there's more information in the static ones before the one you just paused at.
Yeah.
Where that one actually does look like it has information.
Yeah. And so if I put that in play, you can see every so often, even in some of the higher ones here.
And I thought that at the end, I would see just black.
Yeah.
But no, it's still some weird.
Well,
Noise.
okay. So let me caveat that a little bit. You would expect to see one gray level,
Right.
right? And in fact, you are. All right. So this I just did to you what I yell at every student about doing to me all the time. Right? Every frame here is scaled differently. So every frame here is contrast stretched.
Oh.
All right, which is absolutely the worst thing I could ever do. But the reason I did that was I wanted you to see the structure, the spatial structure that comes back. So very good observation. That should be 1 grade level because the variance here is 0,
Right.
right? But that image doesn't have a variance of 0. But
So
if I contrast stretch that, you know, I might have digital counts here that go between 117 and 117.2, right? But because I contrast stretch it to go over 0 to 255, it looks like this, right? So this is the thing I will always tell you never to do. If you're showing me images, make sure they're always scaled the same so I know what's going on, except when you want to show me something inside. That's the only reason. Right, but really good observation. Right? But you know, the thing to see here is that the structure does come and go. Right? Now, if there's spatial structure there, that means there's still information in some of those higher order bands. Right? Some significant amount of information that comes back. And that's not good. If my object here is to do a principal component transformation to just remove correlation, I did the job. But if it also is to reduce the size of the data set so that I can have a more stable inverse in a Gaussian maximal likelihood, for instance, I don't know where to start getting rid of bands because there's some significant spatial structure still being shown here. So that's a problem with principal components analysis. That's always going to be the case. Because what does principal components do? So if I asked you this question, let's say on an exam, what does principal components do to your data set? What would you tell me? What does that transformation do?
It orders in terms of variance.
It orders in terms of variance. Variance in what?
Data.
What's that?
Variance of the data, just in a different axis.
Right, so variance just in data itself. In this particular case though, what are we looking at? We're looking at digital count data. So we're looking at variance in digital count data. We're doing a transformation to a new space. And that's all we're looking at. We're just looking at that data. So, now, are we moving correlation also? Okay. So we're performing an axis rotation in 224 space to remove the correlation. We do that successfully. But wouldn't your expectation be that if I am getting rid of all this, that my image quality, if I had to use that as a term, would steadily decrease? Right? And all I would be left with is essentially noise with 0 contrast. But that's not the ordering that I'm getting. All right, so what I wanted to say here, principal component transforms don't always produce images that show steadily decreasing image quality with increasing component frame in that movie. Right? It only produces new components. Those Ys are produced strictly to maximize variance in the lower order bands, right, to order that variance. So in 1988, there was a paper that came out by Green and several other authors that produced what they call the maximum noise fraction, which produces or tries to produce components, principal components, that maximize signal to noise ratio in your data set, rather than just variance. Right? Signal to noise ratio is more closely correlated with image quality, apparent image quality. So let me ask you, when you have image data, variance comes from what? Variance comes from what in your image data set? It comes from spread of the histogram, right? It comes from range of digital counts that you see, brightness changes in your scene, right? So that variance depends on how much spread there is in the digital count values I'm observing. What else contributes to variance? Noise, right? So what do I want to get rid of here? Or how would I like to order my data in principal component space? Do I want to do it by variance, which represents both image information spread of a histogram, so image information plus noise, or would I rather do it just on image information? Right? that's really the answer, right? You really want to do it just on information. You don't want to do it based on the noise. Okay, so if you have let's say we have a hyperspectral sensor, okay, and it's set up in such a way so as a function of wavelength, and if I look at responsivity, it's set up in such a way that I have these, I'll just draw them as Gaussian spectral response functions normalized at 1 across the whole wavelength region that my sensor is sensitive to. They're all the same width. Okay? So those are all the same width. Okay? If that's the case, and I have a reflectance spectra that looks like this, right? That's reflectance. I'm using all the same terms here. That's rho. Let's make that a capital R, responsivity, a spectral response function. Rho is our reflectance. And let me draw up here irradiance, exoatmospheric solar irradiance. This function now. Okay, so let's just pretend we don't have any atmosphere and we have sort of a black body curve. Okay. So I have a changing amount of illumination across my band, across all my bands. I have a different reflectance as a function of bands. Let's say I'm looking just in the visible portion of the spectrum, so out to about 1 micron at this point. So let's say we're going from about, can't draw. All right, 0.4 to 1.1. Right. Silicon spectral response function. Any idea what that looks like? You see that radiometry? Yeah, it kind of peaks where our eyes peak. It's amazing how all this kind of just works. Right, so I don't have any more room to draw. Okay, we draw here. All right, so here's our silicon spectral response function. All right, so it's weak in blue. It's weak out in the infrared. It's strong around green. So I got a lot of problems here. I got weak source combined with weak spectral response function for a detector material, combined with low reflectance. So in that first band, what's my signal noise ratio going to be? Pretty low, right? And around green, it'll be pretty high. And as I go out further in the infrared, it's going to be pretty low again. So my signal noise ratio here is going to change as a function of band location, right? But it would be really cool if I could transform this data set so that signal noise ratio decreased as a function of band. So I could order them. Because then I can represent, if I have high signal noise ratio, it means I represent a lot of information. I could then choose the bands that have the highest signal noise ratio, use those to do my analyses with. And that's what this minimum noise fraction transform is going to try and do. All right, now let's take one other look here. Did I ever show you the spectral response functions for Landsat? Wait, let's look those up real quick. And don't pick on me. I'm going to use Google here. Okay. All right. I'm going to Google. Let's see. Landsat. Spectral response functions. That's the data, no plot. That's good images.
They had graphics if you click
Did they?
on one. It's like the first column says graphics.
Oh, sweet. Okay. All right, so that's band 1. I'd like to get them all on there at the same time. If we could. No, let's just. There we go. All right, so there's the Landsat spectral response functions. So band 1, band 2, band 3, band 4, band 5, and band 7. Okay? What do you notice about them? Right from the start. Are they all the same width? No. Why aren't they all the same width?
Less energy, higher wavelengths.
Less energy.
Larger width to get enough photons to get an image.
Yeah. You make the bandpass wider to collect more photons. These bandpasses are chosen in such a way that the signal-to-noise ratio is identical in all the bands. Right? The widths are, they choose them wider so that they can get the same SNR across the whole spectrum.
So the noise is the same
So
across
the noise is the same. Yeah. Now, all right, so you've heard about principal components transformations before. You might not know what they were, you might know what they were, you might have applied one in the past. And it's been used since the 1970s on Landsat data, and the world has been perfectly happy in the results that they've gotten. Why? Because it works really nicely because the bands are chosen in such a way that the signal-to-noise ratio is the same in all the bands. All right, along came hyperspectral data sets. Signal-noise ratio is no longer the same in all bands. So the same people who've been using principal components for forever started using it on hyperspectral data. And some people never noticed that the results weren't quite as good as they could have been, and other people started to think about it. And that's why this paper came out in the late 80s. Go back to course site for a second here. Last paper here in the list by Green. Transformation for ordering multispectral data in terms of image quality with implications for noise removal. This is what has become, over the years, known as the minimum noise fraction transformation. And it's designed to overcome what we just saw, the fact that the signal-noise ratio is not equal. And when we order the bands in a principal component transform, image quality doesn't decrease as a function of band number. Right? But this transformation does. And it's actually a really, really simple technique to apply. All right, so let's take a look at it. So, well, let's look at the result first. Let me show you a movie, not PCA, but MNF, minimum noise fraction. So same image. If I play this one, once the structure went away, it pretty much stayed away. Right? There was that one little blip there where you saw it. Right? But in general, it stayed away. If you look at this one, there's more than one blip that it comes back. Okay, so, how does that work? All right, so like we just said, images are combined in two things. They're combined as signal and noise. So if I look at my n-dimensional multivariate observation here, I have n observations for each of the pixels. The signal of each of those individual digital counts observations is made up of the signal portion and the noise portion. We don't have any way of separating those on our own. Right? But if we assume that the signal and the noise are uncorrelated with one another, which most of the time is a good assumption, then we can combine those variances for the noise and the variance for the signal together to form the variance for our entire data set. Okay? All right, so if we think about our data in that way, we could devise this thing or define this thing called a noise fraction. And when you go and you read the original green paper here, oops, where did it go? Right. As you look through, they'll explain their problem, they'll explain what goes on with principal components and say, you know, what they're going to try to achieve here. And then they're going to define this thing called a maximum noise fraction. And they term that MMF. We, over years, this has become known as the minimum noise fraction transform. Right? So some of the terminology that they use here in this paper gets reversed, you know, as more and more people start to look at this. But let's stick with their terminology for a second here. Man, here we go. Yeah, too many windows. All right, we're back. All right, so what we'd like to do is we would like to take that noise fraction. Right? What is a noise fraction? Well, it's just the ratio of the noise variance. Right? So the variance associated with the noise in our observations x sub I divided by the variance in our actual signal x sub I.
This is why it's minimum, because it's 1 over S.
This is noise over signal in this case, yeah. So 1 over S sub I. So we'd like to come up with a transformation, a linear transformation again, y equals g times x, right? So that we can order those noise fractions. Okay.
So that's assuming you can separate the signal and the noise. That's not the total signal plus noise.
This is the noise, and this is the signal. Yeah. So we'll get to how to separate, or at least try to separate as best as possible, because we can't really do that perfectly.
Also, the bottom one is just signal?
It's just signal. So you saw that little blip in the movie come back, right? It wasn't perfect, right? That's because we can't perfectly separate noise from signal.
Right, but because of the notation, I thought that was just
Total.
the total.
Nope, no. This one's just the noise, and this one's just the signal. All right. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to actually take the original data, right? Since the signal and noise are assumed to be uncorrelated, we're going to orthogonalize the data x. And we're going to do that through a transformation. We're going to do that just the same way that we've done it in the past, right, by principal components transformation. And we're going to then take some of the higher order bands and we're going to filter them in such a way, right? Spatially filter. So you're doing convolution kernels and stuff like that in DIM right now. We could do that spatially here and smooth out our data and replace some of the higher order bands, some of the ones that have not a lot of information from the signal in them. And we can go and do a back transform and come back and get back a data set that we hope has those noisiest components removed.
So you are blurring the PCA channels with the minimum energy?
The ones that have the minimum energy, by blurring them, what's the ultimate
But
blur?
it's
How many?
it's more like a salt and pepper noise in those images.
It is.
So why to blur, not to take the median, for example?
Well, my next question would be, what's the ultimate blur that you could do in an image? Is replace it by the mean, by the average. So there are folks who will apply certain size convolution kernels. There are people who apply this that apply a convolution kernel the size of the image, which essentially, you know, if you fill it all with ones, replaces it with the average. Okay. All right, so if we can do that, what we can get back then is this data set in image quality order. Now, there's that special case that we just talked about. Right? Landsat TM, signal noise ratio is the same in all the bands. So we have a problem, or well, actually we don't have a problem, and we have a very good case, where a principal component transformation and a minimum noise fraction transformation will give exactly the same answer. Because the variance in the data is based on image quality. Signal noise ratio is the same in all those bands because of the changing bandwidth. So that's why it's worked so well for so many years for Landsat type images. But you know, when things like Avers came along and those assumptions sort of fell apart because the band pass was always the same and the signal noise ratio changed, then the noise fraction transform needed to come into play. All right, now if you let's see, if you look at what these things might look at in M space, I'm just showing two spaces here. So this is a principal component transform from that original data set. Same data we looked at the other day, right? The Landsat scheme with the 5 classes in it. Principal component 1, principal component 2, fairly nice separation of those classes in those two bands. If you look at the minimum noise fraction transformation for the Landsat data, are those two distributions dramatically different from one another? The way that data is laid out, right? I mean, here's the yellow. There's the light blue, the water, lake water and the river water. And here's the urban scene, or urban pixels. Here's, I forgot the blue and the red were, but what's different between them? And we have an axis flip, and a little bit of a rotation change. Right? Now, if what I said was true, if the principal component transform and the M and F transform were identical, should I have that difference? Should I have seen a flip or a rotation or a flip of the axes? Well, maybe. Maybe the software I wrote to do the M and F transform and the software that I wrote to do the PCA transform, maybe I had a sign reversal and I figured out the eigenvector. It was pointing one way or the other, but it was the same axis, right? So I'm not offended if I see a flip of the axis. But there's a slight rotation here, right? And that rotation theoretically shouldn't be there. But do you believe anything I've said to you? That the signal noise ratio is the same in all the Landsat bands? You know, I mean, that's a big assumption, right, to have that be true. So you are going to get a slight rotation here. So these transformations are going to be slightly different. If I did this for hyperspectral data, though, you would see a very dramatic change in the way these first two bands, these first two transform bands related to one another.
So you don't do PCA again on that X prime. That is your final PCA, right? Because I thought we were going to go back to the X and then do a PCA again, but that is your final.
No. Okay, so I'm going to do. Let me walk through an example. All right. Oops. All right, so what we're going to do in this particular case, you're right, we're going to do two principal component transformations. We're going to take our original data set, order it by the covariance matrix based on noise fraction. Right? Going to transform that. You're going to remove the noisiest bands by smoothing them. You're going to transform that data set back. Now, what do you have in that case?
I think you have the same bands that you had before.
Same
the
bands
same
that you
original
had?
bands.
Yeah, well, what's
With
different
less
about
noise.
it? With less noise, right? I won't say the noise is gone, but the noise is reduced, or a lot of times they'll refer to it as whitened, right? Where the noise has essentially the same magnitude across all the bands. If I can do that, if I can whiten the noise, the Landsat data is already whitened because of the band pass changes, right? But if I can whiten the noise in these bands, and now I do just a traditional principal component transform, what happens? Well, now it orders based on image quality. All right, but it's tricky, right? I mean, you need to come up with that noise estimate, right? A noise estimate's tough to come up with, right? So these guys presented a really simple way to do it, which works pretty well. All right, now the noise covariance matrix is estimated as the what am I representing here? Covariance matrix of delta. What is delta? Well, delta in this case is an image minus an image, the same image, shifted by 1 pixel. So let me ask you, if you look at this room, look at the front of the room, well, look at the slide right here. if I took this slide and I shifted it 1 pixel to the left and I subtracted it from this slide, what would you have? What would your value there be? Right? Everywhere it would be 0, except where? Edges. Right? Now, the number of edges in this image is relatively small to the total area. So if I do that, and I do that subtraction, and I compute the covariance of that, the variance or the variance in that data set is going to be due to what? It's just going to be due to those changes at the edges. Right? And since it's a relatively small number of pixels, it should have very little effect. Okay? It's not perfect, right? And that's why you saw that structure come back, right? Because it can't be perfect. All right, so let's do this. Let's try an example here. This is a Landsat scene, Lake Ontario. And what I've done here is I've added uniform random noise to the scene. Right? So if I look at the mean and the variance for this particular band, mean was 48, variance was 2200. I added noise to it, which essentially had a mean of 0, right? And a standard deviation of 85. And here's the sum. Mean is 48.3, right? So it didn't change all that much. But it didn't change at all here. It actually is 48.32, but I just dropped that off to make it look like it didn't change at all, which it shouldn't if it had 0 mean. But the variance went up, right? Because these were independent from one another. The noise was independent from the image data. The variance went up, and it went up as the sum, right? So if I add these two together, I get the sum that I have down here, 2361. All right, if I shift that image by 1 pixel and subtract it from itself, in this case, I actually shifted 1 in x and 1 in y. Right, so delta is a shift of 1 in x and 1 in y. Here's the image I get. Right? You can see the edges. In the water, it's actually very smooth, but if you look on this monitor, you can see some edges even in the water. And on the land, you definitely see some. But if I took the mean of that difference, the mean comes out to 0 to 2 decimal places, and the variance comes out to 89.3. Well, what did I add in? I added in 85.4. So the variance here is slightly higher, because you do still have some contrast. You apply to the histogram of this, it wouldn't have 0 width. It would have some finite width. So the variance is a little bit larger here. But if I now take the covariance matrix of that set of data, I now have a noise covariance matrix, or at least an estimate of it. Okay? So that's one way to approach it. Other folks approach it by closing the shutter on the imaging system and taking a no impingement light image. Right? Form an image of a blocked aperture. Now you have noise from the sensor. Compute your noise covariance matrix from that. You don't always have that opportunity now. I can't close the shutter on Landsat, for instance. So this is an approach that you can use with when you don't have that opportunity. But if you do have the opportunity, you're much better off being able to take a dark image.
Could you go back to the slide where you have the approximation?
Which one?
That one. So it's just, so you're constructing a covariance matrix of the difference between the shifted image, now again, and the next one.
Right here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so what I'm saying here is my covariance matrix for my noise is approximately equal to the covariance matrix of a shifted difference image, or an image of shifted differences. So x minus x delta. Delta, in this case, was shift by 1 to the left, 1 down, and subtract those two images from one another. All right, so like I said, Dave's here. Ready to dazzle them with all our projects?
I don't know about that. I'll try it. Show me 1 meter data.
1 meter, Dave.
Where do I put this in?
Yep, number 1.
And then where do I drag it so we can open this charts?
Just put it on this.
Okay. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dave Messenger. I'm the director of the Digital Imaging and Remote Sensing Lab. which, given that you guys are taking remote sensing, presumably you've heard of. So the way we go about not assigning, I don't like that word assigning, but choosing thesis projects works a little different than some of the other groups, just because we have a lot of projects. So this is how this is basically how we do it. So I'm going to give you a number of projects right now that we need students on. Right? So we write a proposal for a grant or something. We write into that grant money to fund students to do research, and we promise to do things under that grant. Okay? So we have a lot of ongoing projects that need students right now because they're multi-year projects and students are graduating, or they're things that we just recently won. We also have a number of projects that are a little less likely because they're in the proposal stage. We've got a proposal out right now and we're waiting to hear back. And we've also got a bunch of projects that are sort of dream projects, something I really want to do. Maybe I have a proposal out there, but if you're interested in it, I'm really going to try and fight hard to get money for it, right? The goal is to make sure all of you guys get paid on June 1st, okay? Because your first year funding basically runs out at the end of the spring quarter, okay? So by the time that June 1st comes around, you guys have to be assigned to an actual research project that you can start, paying rent out of. All that fun stuff. So these projects span several faculty and research areas across the remote sensing lab. Okay, so you're going to see there's a very wide range of stuff that goes on here. In one or two charts, there's no way I can summarize $1 million research project. Okay, so one of the goals here, and Carl's going to post the charts to whatever the magic stuff.
Right on the site where all the slides are posted. I'll post
right.
them
Every one of these charts, every one of these projects has a point of contact or a principal investigator, somebody that's in charge of the project. So the goal here is when you see something you think you might be interested in, write down the name of that project or something so you can remember it, and then go talk to that person. Okay, go get more information about what that project actually encompasses. Okay, for each project, I'm going to give you a very brief description. I'm going to tell you who's the funding source, give you the point of contact within DEERS. Some of our projects, if they're only like 1 year worth of funding, we really only want to fund master's level students on them, just because I don't want to commit to you as a PhD student who is going to be here for another 7 or 8 years if I only have 1 year of funding, right? So this is your homework assignment. You guys send back to me your top 3 preferences, ranked. This is my favorite, this is my second favorite, this is my third favorite. And if there's something on there you absolutely do not want to do, let me know as well. Okay? Historically, we find that, and this always works to most of our surprise, you guys don't all choose the same projects as your top choice. And so we always try to work hard to get everybody their first or second choice. Okay? If, on the other hand, none of these projects really strikes your fancy as something you absolutely want to do, then just come and talk to me or talk to other faculty members, right? Again, it's impossible to summarize everything that's going on in a big research project in 1 or 2 charts. So if you really want to do some aspect of some algorithm or technique or something, and it's not up here, well, we may still be able to slide that in under one of our projects, right? So this is my chance to give you what I think is the appropriate information, which is probably wrong. If you don't like what's up here, then you come back to me and give me your information, and then we try to do the matching that way. Okay? Does that sort of make sense? Okay. I've broken these projects down into 3 sort of categories. Things that I have money for right now. Okay? Things that I know I can fund somebody on June 1st. Okay? Then I've got things that are what I call moderate probability. These are things where somebody has told us that they want to fund us, but we don't have the money. Or proposals that are out that we think have at least a 50-50 shot at being funded. And then projects that are low probability. Things that I've got a proposal out, but I don't know, it's a bit of a stretch. Or in one particular case, I have a faculty member who has a crazy idea, and if there's a student interested in it, he'll try and get funding for it. And it's actually a very easy project. So. Compressive sensing algorithm evaluation. Compressive sensing is a new mathematical theory. It's only been around for about 4 or 5 years, maybe 6 years by now, as a way to sample a scene spatially, spectrally, temporally, and then use correlations in the data to reconstruct the image. It's been used very effectively in several traditional image processing domains with black and white imagery or RGB imagery, and in the medical imaging domain. People are trying to apply it to hyperspectral imagery nowadays. and see, can we use this as a way to sort of downsample the image but still do things appropriately. We have some folks, we're not doing compressive sensing here, but we have somebody who's committed funding to us to say, if I give you some images that are simulated as being collected from a compressive sensing sensor and then reconstructed with various types of algorithms, how can you tell me how well we did, right? So this is sort of an image quality, image utility thing. Can you tell me, are any of these techniques worthwhile for some of the standard sort of hyperspectral applications, target detection, anomaly detection, classification, all the things you're going to learn about next quarter. This is something that I'm in charge of, and this is only 1 year of funding, so it's really a single master's student on this one. The Deers Lab is going to fund a big experiment in the fall, very, very likely. I mean, very big, like 4 or 5 airplanes in the air. Every imaging modality you can pretty much think of, we're going to try to have either airplanes or satellites collecting data. We are committing funding to a student to participate starting in the summer in designing the experiment and in building the ground truth targets, learning how to take ground truth measurements, and then participating in the experiment sometime in September, and then spending the better part of the next year or year and a half gathering all the data, organizing all the data, doing analysis on the data, so actually developing their own algorithms and working on this specific data set, as well as helping to build a dissemination portal, probably over the web. Okay, again, this is a master's student. This is being funded by Deers internally. If you have questions about it, come talk to me, although the advisor is, everybody in the lab is going to be involved in this, so the advisor could pretty much be any one of us. But if you're interested in the experimental side of remote sensing and actually what can be done from an experimental side of things, this is a good master's project. We have lots of work on taking 2D imagery and extracting 3D features from them. This is primarily driven by a large NSF program, but we have other corporate sponsors as well. This project's been going on for the better part of a year or so, and we're funding a large number of master's students on it, and a couple of them are expected to graduate sometime in this summer or fall. And so right now we're looking at adding 1 master's level student. And the basic idea is there are some very advanced, cool computer vision photogrammetry techniques to take a bunch of 2D images of the same object from different perspectives. And if you know where the cameras are, then you can reconstruct the 3D point location of every pixel in all of those images, essentially. Carl's heavily involved in this, as are Jan Van Aert and John Karakas. So again, there's 3 or 4 different sponsors and sources of money in funding all of this stuff. We're looking to add about 1 student. So it's not clear which one of these 3 folks is going to be the advisor, but you can talk to any one of them about the ongoing project. Amanda was bored.
I was going to say.
Wanted to add color to them. Landsat, you were just looking at Landsat imagery. The Deers Lab has been maintaining the thermal calibration on Landsat for something like the last 20 years. John Schott is the primary Landsat guy, and there's a lot of other people involved in doing this. The way we typically do this is people go out on the lake, on Lake Ontario during the summer, and you make surface temperature measurements of the water. You use things like ModTran, which you probably haven't learned about yet? No, you've learned about ModTran. You're all ModTran experts. You use things like ModTran to propagate that surface temperature up to the sensor, and then you make comparisons between what the sensor saw and what you predicted they should see, and that's how you maintain calibration. For the last couple of years, we've been working on, instead of having people go out on the lake, we've had, trying to use weather data and temperature data off of buoys that are dispersed over the entire Great Lakes. And so the interest here is focusing on automating these techniques and refining the methodology to build a well-calibrated temperature product for Landsat. John Schott is the one you want to talk to about that. Again, John is heavily involved in DeerSig modeling for Landsat 8, the next generation Landsat, which is scheduled to be launched in just about 12 months. It's going to have 2 instruments on it, a visible or reflective instrument called the Orbital Land Imager, or OLI, and a thermal instrument called TIRS. TIRS was added on at the very last minute, and it is literally a thermal sensor bolted onto the side of the satellite. And it's a thermal sensor that has its own cryocooler and things like that, so it shakes. which shakes the other sensor, which means the band-to-band registration is really complicated. How are they going to produce data products, all that stuff. We're attacking this problem by using a simulation package we have called DeerSig, which is a well-established end-to-end scene simulation capability. And we've developed a very advanced system engineering model of Landsat 8. So what you want to do is you want to be able to compare the predicted performance based on the simulation to the observed performance after this thing gets launched, understanding the applications thereof, how do they calibrate it, how do they do the band-to-band registration, how do they remove artifacts, all of these sorts of things. We've been working on this for a while. This is actually Landsat 8. It was just shipped out to be or this is the thermal instrument on Landsat 8. It was just shipped out west to be integrated onto the spacecraft about a week ago. This is a close collaboration with U.S. Geological Survey. You'll work closely with John Schott and Aaron Gerace, who've been doing a lot of the initial simulation work. We're also working with NASA on ways to actually simulate flight of this thing, because it's not going to be launched until January. Involves working with DeerSig, so you'd have to learn how to do all the simulation stuff, and understanding a lot of stuff about the hardware. What is the actual characteristics of the satellite, okay? Turns out this is also another view of Tiers, and I don't think he took the picture, he's not in the bunny suit. One of the guys at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, Matt Montanaro, is actually an alumni of this program who's responsible for calibrating the thermal sensor. Again, John Schott is the contact on that one.
You didn't say whether you wanted a master's
Oh,
or PhD.
you didn't
any
put
of
that on
those.
there?
No.
I'm not sure. Assume both.
Yeah, I think the answer is
I think
both.
either.
Go talk to them.
Either on either of those projects. Those are projects that are going to be going on for a long time. This one I don't know as much about. Tony Vodacek and John Karakis, both from here, and Matt Hoffman, who's a new faculty member in the RIT School of Math. They wrote this proposal to the Air Force. It revolves around this thing called dynamic data-driven application systems, which is essentially a way to build, I'm not going to just take a picture and then try to get information out of it. I want to take pictures, I want to extract some information out of those pictures. I want to put those into some sort of a predictive model that predicts what things should be going on in the system, and then I can use these model predictions to improve the way I collect data in the future. Okay, so we've done, Tony Vodacek has done a lot of work on this stuff in terms of understanding water quality with Lake Ontario, where the modeling part has been hydrologic and hydrographic modeling. John Karakis has done a fair amount of work on this with what are called adaptive sensors. Things like, this is a what do they call this? Digital multi-mirror arrays, just like is in the projector up there, that's put in on the optical path of a system. And so all the mirrors are pointing in one direction and you're just collecting RGB images. And then you find something interesting and you flip that particular couple of pixels over to a spectrometer so you can get spectral information about that particular thing. And so how would you control that thing? You've got to have some other sort of algorithm and model on the outside that's actually predicting what you can see. These guys are actually going to use DeerSig. This is a DeerSig simulation of an urban scene, which I had never seen before. Yeah. So will you be using DeerSig to model these adaptive multimodal sensors to do animations of moving objects? Apparently they're particularly interested in tracking moving objects as they move through a scene. So then you'll have to come up with some also adaptive image processing routines to be developed. This has room for one PhD student on it, or presumably one master's student as well. Either John Karakis or Tony Vodacek are working on that one. There's a faculty meeting in here, right? Okay, so those half a dozen projects or something like that are things that we have money for right now and we need somebody to work on. Okay? So here we move into things that are of moderate probability. And we will likely know on all these things between now and June. All that stuff Carl has been teaching you about statistics of imagery and all that, it's wrong. That's all
I was
good.
upfront about that.
That's all well and good when you're looking at Landsat imagery or AVERIS data with 20 meter pixels and you're averaging out the world. But when you get down to a meter resolution, the world is not multivariate normal. It's not the result of linear processes. None of that crap is true. So which doesn't mean it doesn't work, right? What's that famous statistician? All models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So we have some proposals out there through myself and Nate Cahill in the math department to take dramatically different ways of beating on this data, using applications from graph theory, data mining, computational topology, all the fun math craziness, to build up to ways of representing the data without using means and covariances, right? If I have data that's distributed on the surface of a donut, the mean of that data doesn't tell me anything about the data, right? Now our data are not exclusively donuts, but even in the example Carl showed with those 5 classes in the Landsat data, the mean of that data cloud is not on any of the data points, right? So we've been using these methods from graph theory to build up graphs of the data. Once you have a graphical representation of the data, you can apply some very advanced computational approaches to them, where instead of things like the minimum noise fraction or maximum noise fraction, whatever you want to call it, the MNF transform, there are distance transformations that you can apply to the data and then run applications on them. We have funding in this proposal for 2 PhD students. Like I said, this is coming out of NSF, and we should hear back within the next couple of months. I think we're going to have a 50-50 chance of getting this one. We already have a couple of other graduate students that are working on these things, so if you come and talk to me about that, I'll actually probably point you to other graduate students on this. Nuclear DeerSig. I didn't know what else to call it. DeerSig is, as I said, our scene simulation tool. It's historically been used to simulate what airborne or space-based systems could see in things like passive reflective imaging, thermal imaging, hyperspectral, all those sorts of things. It was ultimately extended to include laser-based imaging, so I can shoot photons down into the scene and model how they, rattle around in the scene and come back. And the Department of Energy has asked us to, or we have submitted a proposal to the Department of Energy under, this is NNSA, stands for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Security Agency. NA22 is the R&D division within NNSA, to integrate other tools that predict how nuclear radiation passes through materials and fuse that with traditional remotely sensed imagery. So what we're hoping to do under this is actually take some existing codes that are more sort of particle-based for how gamma rays and neutrons and all those things move through materials, and fuse that information in with traditional sort of DeerSig simulation stuff. You'll be working primarily with Bob Kremen, Scott Brown, and Rolando Riqueño. These guys are 2 of our big modeling guys, and Bob has experience in nuclear physics. This is also a joint collaboration with some folks at Savannah River National Laboratory, one of the Department of Energy National Labs. If this gets funded, we'll have room for 2 doctoral candidates on this. Oh, let me skip this. This is a DeerSig picture. Okay, another DOE project. This one comes out of Sandia National Laboratories. This is for an MS student, and unfortunately this one requires a student to be a US citizen. Can I use polarimetric imaging of very large areas to detect small man-made objects from natural backgrounds? The polarimetric characterizations of surfaces, if things are shiny, it's like metal type things, then they tend to polarize the light more efficiently than natural backgrounds. So Sandia has this idea of, if I built a very wide field of view sensor but made it polarimetrically sensitive, could I do a better, but probably lower spatial resolution than I would normally have, could I do a better job of pulling small man-made materials out of the natural backgrounds? For those of you that might be interested in this, the Sandia National Labs, when they fund these sorts of projects, it's not usually required, but it's usually hoped that the student will spend the summer out at Sandia National Laboratories on a fully funded internship. Mike Gartley, one of our staff members, is the main contact for that. The funding is pending, but they've done this in the past and they've told us they'll do this in the future. We just don't have any money from them right now. Micro DeerSig. So DeerSig, again, is this big simulation package. It's usually used to simulate things like the campus, right, at some level of resolution. However, you can use the ray tracing approach that the simulation uses to, instead of modeling, this tabletop as one big flat surface, if I'm interested in understanding the BRDF, you guys know what that is yet? Okay, if I'm interested in understanding the BRDF properties of this tabletop, I could make a ton of measurements, right, from a bunch of illumination angles and view angles. Or I can take a few measurements and I can model this thing as a physical microfacet surface, and maybe I want to throw sand on top of it, so I can make a geometric and optical property model of the sand crystals and I can throw it on there. And then I can use the ray tracer in the simulation mode to predict what the BRDF of this material would be. Okay, so again, this is a DOE project out of the same group, out of remote sensing. This would be, when the fund, it says here the funding starts September 1. We'll know before then if we got the funding. So if you're interested in this project and we win it, we'll fund you during the summer. Don't worry about that. That's just when the official program would start. Again, 2 PhD candidates on this one. Carl is the main PI on this one. So this is just an example of the types of things. If I've got some concrete out here and I might know what the BRDF of concrete is, but then somebody's car leaked oil on it, what's the BRDF of that particular signature, right? You can model this as an actual microfacet surface and you can apply the optical properties of this thing to that. And you can look at particularly particle distributions and contaminant concentration on these different surfaces from a modeling perspective, although I think you guys proposed to actually make measurements as well to verify the model, right? Yep. So this one would have both modeling and experimental sorts of sides of it. That's just one. I'm going to skip that because we're out of time. Long wave HSI, you guys probably haven't looked up any of that stuff yet, but the same HSI sorts of sensors we can make in the reflective. Essentially, we can make similar types of things in the thermal infrared. There are novel long-wave hyperspectral instruments that are under development, but the phenomenology is very different. I'm not looking at reflected sunlight. I'm looking at emitted radiation from the surface. And that requires a whole another level of complexity in how we process the data for all the standard sorts of applications that you guys are going to be learning about, material identification, detection. But the phenomenology is really complicated because you're driven both by surface material properties as well as temperature properties and things like that. We don't have any funding for this right now, but we're likely going to be writing a proposal very soon to do this. So this one is a little bit iffy on the funding. But again, we're going to be writing a proposal that will be funding a couple of PhD students on this. Okay, now we get into the relatively low probability stuff. If one of these really strikes somebody's interest, we will make a much larger effort to try and go out and get the funding for it, effectively. But these are things that we feel that we could get funding for if we really wanted to, right? Jan van Aert has a proposal out to NASA to study savanna ecosystems, particularly in the savanna, and understanding the structure and function of the ecosystem. And you get at the structure through using things like remotely sensed data from hyperspectral and laser-based LiDAR imaging techniques. So you want to be able to go in and interrogate a scene and be able to quantify the 3D structure from these what are called waveform LiDAR signals. Right? So if you want more information on that, then go talk to Jan about it. But he works with a group that has an airborne imaging system that not only has one of these waveform LiDAR 3D imaging systems on it, but it also has hyperspectral data on it as well. And you're interested in things like biomass and structural assessment for various vegetation types, particularly in this case in a savanna region. So Jan is the one who's the main point of contact on that. He's been doing a lot of work in this for a long time, and he has another proposal out to NASA right now, which he should be hearing back on this spring. Same sort of thing, but this one is not involved with using the hyperspectral as much. This one is more involved with just using the waveform LiDAR. Again, this one is specifically for woody resources, where the other one also looks at grasslands and things like that. The idea is you want to be able to quantify the 3D structure using this very complicated waveform LiDAR signal. These waveform LiDARs are very complex signal processing sorts of problems, especially when you want to try to tie them to real physical quantities. Again, this is a proposal that's currently out to NSF, and it could be an MS or a PhD depending upon what the student actually wants to do with that. John Carrick sent me this morning. He said it's a crazy random thought that he had been thinking about, and if somebody was really interested in, he would try to secure funding for it. the application of music theory techniques which describe structure to remote sensing image analysis. So this is an interesting actually idea. If you think of music as a series of signals, which they are, right? There are very common things that make sense to the human ear brain system. Things like dissonance and things like harmony, right? So could you use those same sorts of signal processing approaches that are applied to music theory in terms of what causes dissonance and what causes harmony and those sorts of things? Can you use that as well as there's things called source separation techniques. If I've got 5 instruments playing at the same time, but I don't know how many of them there are, how can I tell you that there are actually 5 of them, right? Sort of things. Those are called source separation problems. So can a remote sensing image be analyzed through this? You want somebody with an interest and background in music, okay? Talk to John about that one. He sent that to me this morning. Love our job, right? Okay, we have an ongoing project to use hyperspectral, space-based hyperspectral remote sensing to support a very long ongoing archaeological survey in Oaxaca, Mexico, which is in very southern Mexico. It's the site of what was the Zapotec civilization. It was one of the first civilizations in North America that had written language and government and all those sorts of things. And the question that the archaeologists want to know is, at the civilization level, were they able to exist, survive, and grow because the landscape provided them the right sorts of material in terms of agriculture, getting beyond just sort of sustainable agriculture, or did they grow and then change the landscape in such a way that they could further grow, right? Which impacted which sort of thing? We have collected something like 60 or 70 Hyperion scenes. Hyperion is a NASA space-based hyperspectral system, 30-meter spatial resolution linear series sensor with very low signal to noise, nasty smile, bad registration, all kinds of good stuff. The sensor is likely going to die in the next 6 months, something like that. It's running out of fuel, but we have a huge amount of data. And I currently have one student who's been working on this, Kelly Canham, and she's only looked at a couple of the flight lines realistically. And so there's a huge other project involved in this. We have a proposal out to NASA right now to continue this project. It's currently funded by NASA, but we have a proposal to continue this. This is with me and Bill Middleton, who's actually an archaeologist in the RIT College of Liberal Arts, and we have room for probably one PhD student on that one. There's nothing we can do to generate more money on this particular one. It's just NASA's kind of, never know when you submit a NASA proposal whether it's going to get funded or not. Okay, so that's it, and Carl's going to give you guys these charts so you've got the information and the points of contact. Okay? There's a lot more of these projects than there are you guys. Which is why I came and talked to you guys in December. Nevertheless, so again, this is just basically the same thing I had before. Send me your top 3 preferences, right, and rank them 1, 2, and 3. And let me know if there's, if you have no interest in DeerSig, right, in the simulation side of things, just tell me that, just so I don't waste our time by saying, hey, I've got room on this DeerSig project, why don't you think about doing it? But before you do this, don't do this to me in the next 10 minutes, right? Go spend a couple of weeks talking to people and get a lot more information about these projects, because they're all a lot bigger than what I just presented to you. If you can get me, because of the break and things like this, you guys actually have about a month to figure this out. Okay, so what this really means is, even if you send me your requests or your preferences next Wednesday, we're not going to do anything with them until we get everybody's, okay? Unless, and this also happens, you go talk to an individual faculty member, and the two of you, through talking, say, yeah, the faculty member says, you're exactly the right person for this, and you say, I really want to work on that. And then the faculty, you put that in as your first choice, and the faculty member will come to me and say, I've already made my decision, I want that person to work on it, right? So this is why it's critical for you guys in the next few weeks to really go out and talk to people. And the only reason I have this date as March 14th is I assume most of you would not be around during spring break week, right? So do this relatively quickly, go talk to people, and then we'll match people with their preferences as soon as we can. Hopefully we'll let everybody know on or about April 1st, right? I think I have a picture in here. Yeah, so I took out the names, but this is basically what I do with it, right? So we make a little Excel spreadsheet and we put everybody's names over here and we put all the projects down here. And so this person, I think blue is the first choice, so they really wanted to work on that. They kind of wanted to work on that. They sort of wanted to work on that, and they really didn't want to work on this project, right? And then we basically do this, and we go through and we ultimately, you know, make assignments to people. Okay, so this is the process. It generally works well. The goal here is, I mean, I could just assign you guys projects, right? I mean, I could just, you know, everybody pick a number out of the hat, or I'm just going to choose because I'm mean or something, right? But if I'm going to assign you to work on a project for the next, you know, 7 or 8 years, you better like it. Otherwise, you're going to kill yourself, right? So you have to have some input into what is going on, right? We want you guys to be working on projects you're interested in, or imaging modalities that you're interested in. If you don't care about thermal imaging, tell me, right? And we'll just take all the thermal projects off the table. If you're really interested in something to do with LiDAR, okay, give me that information as well. The more information we can get from you guys, but please, some students, I've had students in the past write like a 3-page report on what they wanted to work on in their entire history, right? Don't do that either. But just give me as much information as you can, just in your project priorities and, you know, some bullet points about, you know, things that you're interested, techniques you're interested in, sensing modalities you're interested in, applications. If you're really interested in forestry, right, let me know. If you're really interested in ice, right? So give me this information in the next few weeks, okay? Are there questions on the process? If you have questions on the topics, really go see the points of contact. I mean, I can't probably, other than my projects, I can't tell you anything I did today. All right? Thanks, guys. Probably.